This PowerPoint is on defining attitude, which is part of chapter 12. A quote I like is, attitude is a little thing that makes a big difference. I think that's true. I think attitude is a little thing, but it can make a huge difference in your perspective on situations and just the world around us. So let's start by defining attitude. Attitude is our evaluation of a person, an idea, or an object. Typically, attitudes are either favorable or unfavorable, positive or negative, and they have three components. They have an affective component, which is the feelings, a behavioral component, the effect of the attitude on your behavior, and a cognitive component, which is your beliefs and knowledge. I think this goes back to something I've said over and over again. One of the main ideas of psychology is the connection between our feelings and our thoughts and our behaviors. And so attitude encompasses that connection. Attitudes are influenced by external and internal forces. So let's take a look at some concepts related to attitude. Cognitive dissonance is one of those concepts, and it is the psychological discomfort we experience when we hold two or more conflicting beliefs, attitudes, or values simultaneously. To resolve this tension, we often change, justify, or ignore the conflicting information. An example on the left of cognitive dissonance is you might think, liars are bad people, but I just lied. So those are two conflicting thoughts, and so it's very uncomfortable to have those two conflicting thoughts, as you can imagine. So in order to resolve that tension, we change our thoughts or justify our thoughts or just completely ignore one of the thoughts, so because we don't like that discomfort. So how do we relieve the cognitive dissonance? I just discussed that a little bit, but to go further, we change our behavior. In other words, we just stop lying. We justify, we tell ourselves that everyone else lies, or I had no other choice but to lie, or we simply ignore it. We just pretend that lying is not a negative behavior. It is worth noting that even if cognitive dissonance is consciously relieved, there may still be some underlying or like subconscious tension that perhaps our body experiences, but we're not fully aware of. Let's look at the justification of effort. We value goals and achievements that we put a lot of effort into. According to this theory, if something is difficult for us to achieve, we believe it is more worthwhile. An example would be enduring hazing activities in order to join a fraternity. Experience hazing is difficult, but we feel like it's worth it to be a member of the fraternity, so we justify that difficult effort. Just another definition on the top. I evaluate an outcome relative to the amount of effort it took to achieve it. So if something that requires a lot of effort to achieve, we're going to evaluate and honor that outcome even more. Persuasion. Persuasion is the process of changing our attitude towards something based on some kind of communication. Much of the persuasion we experience comes from outside forces. So what influences the power of persuasion? What makes someone more persuasive than another person? Well, the credibility of the speaker. In other words, if they have knowledge of the topic and they seem trustworthy, then we're going to consider them much more credible and probably be more likely to be persuaded by them. Believe it or not, the physical attractiveness of the speaker. If they're more physically attractive to us, they may be more easily to persuade us. Our level of attention. When we're watching someone speak, if we're fully under their spell and in their attention, then we're probably more likely to be persuaded. But if we're not paying very much attention, we're not taking it in, we're much less likely for that person to persuade us. And another idea, a quote from your book, is that people with lower intelligence are more easily persuaded than people with higher intelligence, whereas people with moderate self-esteem are more easily persuaded than people with higher or lower self-esteem. And younger adults aged 18 to 25 are more persuadable than older adults. So younger adults, it seems like, are more easily persuaded. So let's look at persuasion and the elaboration likelihood model. According to that model, there are two ways people process information: centrally and peripherally. And I think the video below, which unfortunately you can't access because you can't click into it from YouTube, but I will post it in an announcement this week because I think it does a great job of explaining the elaboration likelihood model. The foot in the door technique is another type of persuasion. In that technique, the persuader gets a person to agree to bestow a small favor or to buy a small item, only to later request a larger favor or purchase of a bigger item. For example, a friend asked to borrow a small amount of money and then later asked to borrow a large amount of money. So they've kind of gotten you hooked by asking to only borrow a small amount. And then once you're hooked, you're more easily persuaded to let them borrow a larger amount. Foot in the door, just from the picture, persuading people to agree with an initial request and then increasing the demand. So those are just some concepts related to persuasion and attitude, how our attitudes are, how they change and what they are. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.